Steve Rivard, and I think I'm the only non-author here tonight, so thank Groundwork Center so much for inviting me up here. In 2007, I started an organic farming business. I did it because medicine, food as medicine, is not shared, unfortunately, by the medical community at large here in America. And we have a pharmaceutically-based medical and a chemically-based farming system predominantly in this country. And so I co-founded Iroquois Valley Farms in 2007 and began to explore how Western culture got there. As she made mention, I started my practice in emergency medicine in 1979 right here in Michigan. Did you guys know that you invented emergency medicine? Yeah, it was invented right here in Michigan. You and Michigan State and University of Michigan and Akron, Ohio, and Hennepin County were the first. And when I heard this brand new thing start, I thought, oh, I've got to go try that. So I ended up here in Grand Rapids, which was pretty cool. For the next 27 years, I worked fairly diligently in the emergency room with a population of wide scope of practice that defines emergency medicine, from pediatrics to geriatrics and anyone in between. And over those years, a few things started to happen to me as a physician and as a person. Early on in my life, my son was sick, and almost everything he ate made him sick. And I didn't make the connection between his food and his ill health. No one had ever taught us in medical school about that. When I discovered, though, that my son was allergic to many of the foods that he was eating to the point of suffocation, and I would sit up with him at night doing albuterol nebulizers, and it was the beginning of my awakening. As the years went on in emergency medicine, more and more food allergy patients began to arrive, and a new phenomenon began to appear. And this phenomenon was obesity in young kids. I'd never seen that before. And a new disease entity called type 2 diabetes was formed. And I thought, how did I miss that? Well, it was formerly called adult onset diabetes, but because children were obese at such a young age, they were getting diabetes. Neurologic disorders like ADD and ADHD, Alzheimer's, and the spectrum of autism were becoming much more common. The second awakening for me happened after my son and daughter married and our granddaughter was born. And she too had the same kind of allergic phenomenon. And at that time, I started studying then with functional medicine and integrative medicine doctors for a different perspective on food health and human health, and which is the basis of their practice. I mean, it makes sense. If we feed our bodies nutritious food free of chemical poisons and GMOs, our bodies will either not get sick or they'll heal itself. That made intuitive sense to me. And while the value of modern vaccines and some medicines are useful, I've experienced personally some of the limitations of Western medicine and its forgotten connection to food health and how its altered food was affecting us. During my time in the ER, I personally cared for farmers who were sprayed with organophosphates, and it took 3 days in the intensive care unit to save them. Sadly, a 4-year-old died after splashing it on himself in his father's shed. So at that time, my dear friend Dave Miller and I, he was my college roommate, by the way, he decided to quit his job as a banker for Bank of America, and he wanted to start this new thing called organic farming. And he and I talked, and I became curious as to how we got to where we are, pharmaceutically-based medicine and chemically-based farming. So I started my journey to try and figure that out. The use of chemicals to improve our life has its roots in the early 1900s. Combined with other investigations that had gone, Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch were two of the first well-known scientists to discover microbes and how it could harm animals and humans, and were able to isolate specific microbes that cause specific diseases. In Strasbourg, France, while working with winemakers, Louis Pasteur was able to isolate the specific microbe. And that was the beginning of his study that led him to then experiment with starting inoculating sheep for anthrax and later dogs for rabies. Robert Koch, who was working in Germany at the same time, started the same thing, and the two of them began to identify different bacteria. Koch investigated the bacterium that causes tuberculosis. And these two scientists are considered the founders of modern microbiology and created what was called the germ theory of disease. This revolutionized our entire understanding and approach to human health. The benefits to human life couldn't be discounted, nor, as we will see, could the economics of it. To this day, the germ theory of disease is still the driving ideology of modern medicine. Discoveries of spectromycin and other antibiotics from the soil and penicillin from mold, and their uses hastened and cemented the chemical basis for modern medicine. Suddenly, physicians in the population realized they could take a pill and their sickness would subside very quickly. They would get much better. Our Western culture began to believe that we had possibly discovered or conquered disease, and that if we felt badly, all we needed to do was take a pill. So strongly has this taken hold that 150 years later, we practically have a new drug now for each new symptom. If you watch any TV show, you'll get 5 commercials on drugs. But I believe, as I've observed, that society from 40 years ago to today, we're sicker than we were then, at 2,000% more cost now than when I first started. A piece of the puzzle was missing. Farming and chemical farming dates back 5,000 years at least, but it wasn't until around the 1840s, working from other experiments that were done on plants, that the chemist von Liebig decided that he would burn wood and collect the data about what was in it. He knew that carbon dioxide came from the atmosphere, not from rotting humus. And he discovered that the ash of the wood was mostly carbon dioxide, but also rich in nitrogens and phosphorus, potassium, and trace elements. And he reasoned that all plants needed was the correct amount of elements to be fertile and to flourish. The law of the minimum, which is to this day considered by many the accepted farming philosophy, is something that he then published. The law states that the chemical in shortest supply will limit plant growth, and that there are 5 key elements: water, CO2, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Once published, the appeal was almost instantaneous. Because of a fluke thing, an explorer had found guano, which he didn't know what it was. But guano was taken back to Europe at the very same time, and they identified that it was 30% higher in nitrogen and phosphorus. So they started putting it on the earth, and crop production took off. So for 7 years, at the same time in Rothamsted, England, a board researcher who owned the large farm started doing a comparative between chemical farming and organic farming, and he found at that same time that in fact if you use chemicals, the farm crops grew fast and beat the organic development or production for at least the first 7 years. They really didn't look beyond that. The flaw in this design is that they needed new seeds every year for the chemical farming. They didn't pay attention to that fact. Our atmosphere is abundant in nitrogen, making up to 70% of the air that we breathe. And in the 20th century, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch became the first to successfully create a method to sort of snatch nitrogen from the atmosphere and produce ammonium nitrate. They didn't do it for the farmers. They did it to make bombs. At the end of that war, at the Versailles Treaty, the United States forced Bosch and Haber to give them their method. And to this day, the Bosch-Haber process is still used in modern farming and supplies most of our synthetic fertilizer. Probably half the nitrogen that's in our body right now is from the Bosch-Haber production, which is pretty fascinating to me. Not everybody agreed with that farming method. You shouldn't have ice in your glass when you give a speech. An English agriculturalist by the name of Sir Albert Howard considered the farming of modern organic farming, the father of, believed that organic matter was the key to soil fertility over the long haul and would produce healthier plants with better and more abundant food. And he, almost predicting the future, reasoned that the use of synthetic fertilizers and chemicals would cause the plants to weaken, robbing them of the natural way they needed to absorb elements from the earth. Doing his own agricultural experiments as the imperial botanist for the colonial government of India, he noticed farmers growing without insecticides and fungicides, perfectly good product. This was eye-opening to him. And he wrote in 1910, I've learned to grow healthy crops practically free of all disease without the slightest help of chemical herbicides, fungicides, or insecticides. He believed the missing piece to successful farming and plant health was in its microbiology, not its chemistry. The mycorrhizae, the symbiotic zone of plant root, bacteria, and fungus. He felt chemical sprays were akin to steroids, sort of leading to quick, unsustainable growth, and that agrochemicals treated symptoms, not causes. In 1920, he wrote, "The slow poisoning of the earth and the soil by artificial sprays is one of the greatest calamities which has befallen agriculture and mankind." 1920. While he still couldn't have known at that time just how symbiotically interconnected plant health to the surrounding soil and bacteria and funguses, new data and the use of the electron microscope has begun to reveal just how intimately and critically related this relationship is. Today, it's also undoubted to say that the dead soil monoculture is sicker than it's ever been. And had Sir Howard been around, he would have found out that in 1973 the Rothamsted study stopped, but when it did, they found that the organic production had equaled the the chemically produced farms every good year, and that in the bad years had outproduced them by 45% at half the cost and no chemical poisonings. The Rodale Institute, by the way, has been doing that same research for the last 30 years and have found the identical data. With Western agriculture and human health deteriorating, once again, it's up to the organic farmers to lead the way. The causes for the shift to an organic farm or organic farming by many could be economics or personal health or a moral compass, with concerns about the chemicals they were spraying on the food that they were producing. These organic farmers realized their prior growing methods were both unhealthy and unsustainable. Likewise, for 12 to 15 years, some researchers and physicians, discouraged with increasing workloads and more dependence on pharmaceuticals and the declining health of their patients in spite of it, began to search for other approaches to health. Our patients were worse and healthcare costs were skyrocketing. Had Sir Albert had the electron microscope with today's capabilities, he would have been able to demonstrate that plant health is indeed intimately reliant on symbiotic relationship between bacteria and microbes and fungus. And the plants can excrete endocrine sugars that attract and feed beneficial bacteria. The bacteria and fungus break down compost and humus and extract essential elements from the soil and rock, with the fungus attaching to plant roots to absorb water from long distances. Symbiotically, the mycorrhizae and fungus feed each other for the benefit of all. It helps the plant fend off foes both above and below the soil. Human health works exactly the same way, we're discovering. An enormous number of bacteria in our body work symbiotically with us to keep us healthy, and the source of these microbes, primarily in our gut, is from our food. In the germ theory, we've isolated and identified 1,400 different pathogens that can harm us. But recently we found over 1 million microbes that live in us beneficially. In fact, without them we would die. The human gut, responsible for 80% of our immunity, is lined with these bacteria, as is all parts of us. In fact, the gut lining, bacteria make up every other cell. For example, our human cells make mucus sugars which coat the intestinal wall while it feeds neighbor microbes. Our gut bacteria in return help detect pathogens or invaders and help regulate the production of proteins to fight off these barbarians. They make vitamin K for blood clotting and excrete B12, which is essential for our nervous system's function. I can't read that without 2 minutes. Yikes. Okay. All right. So I've got to sort of cut to the chase here. I won't tell you about a fascinating study by Dr. Liping Zhao, but in the end of his study, he found that in changing his diet, he recollected the bacteria in his gut only to find F. prausnitzii, which is a bacteria that's essential for the protection of our gut lining and effectively stops ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. He eliminated another bacteria called Enterobacter, which is responsible for this endotoxin stops the uptake of insulin and is responsible for obesity and diabetes. Here's another thing that's worth saying in my 2 minutes. And our gut bacteria plays a significant role in helping to regulate our inflammatory process. A small insult or infection requires only a small response. And it's our gut bacteria that decreases our inflammatory response to a measured level. The overuse of antibiotics kills the beneficial bacteria needed to suppress our inflammatory response and set up a low-grade inflammatory state. This is no small matter, as chronic inflammation is responsible for 75% of the disease in our society, including cancer. 12 years ago, Iroquois Valley Farms was founded to help support and accelerate our farmers, creating the paradigm shift toward better health through better food. In that time, we've seen the consumer preference for organic food rise from 1% to 6%. It's my observation in the 40 years of my medicine that the healthcare system is unsustainable and expensive in a way that it's being applied. It's also becoming more evident that chemical farming is less profitable and clearly hurting the earth. The paradigm shifts we are witnessing in farm and healthcare go hand in hand and are immensely important. We at Iroquois Valley Farmland REIT, Real Estate Investment Trust, is what that means, have endeavored to support farmers and increase the acreage of organic farmland. We are the first organic farmland REIT in the world. The company is founded as a public benefit corp. It is B-Lab certified. It is a top 50 impact investment. We became a REIT, a real estate investment trust, to democratize food and farm health by allowing everyone to invest in their and their children's health through better food and healthier farms. So that's us, Iroquois Valley.